Indo-European clans continued the legacy of the Roman Empire. Rome not only survived but thrived when the Nephilim races of Europe united in the Middle Ages. We will continue our discussion about the characteristics of the Indo-Europeans in Germany and see how history was altered to promote a Eurocentric narrative of supremacy. The first thing we need to do is to accept the fact that the history books are full of lies. Napoleon Bonaparte, a military and political leader, said, "History is a set of lies agreed upon." Why would he say that? He was admitting the truth. Indo-European clans wanted to continue the legacy of the Roman Empire, so they altered history to promote a narrative of supremacy. Thankfully, there were some who risked being ostracized to tell the truth. Now we have to piece their writings together to get a better understanding of history. As I study this information, it's obvious to me that a lot of lies and fairy tales were written during the Middle Ages, and it passed down to us as historical fact. This article from History Tools will tell us why. It says the discipline of history in the Middle Ages can be categorized into two rough eras: the early and high Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages covers the 6th century through the 10th, during which time the Germanic people of Europe rose to the power vacuum left by the fall of Rome. Many of the first works of history in this time period came from a desire to show where a people came from and prove that they had some legitimate claim in picking up Rome's mantle as the bearers of Christianity. We are now left with sorting through the lies. Lies were told about historical events and the people who lived in ancient times. Just think about this. The Egyptians painted images of themselves so that we would know what they looked like. But we have folks today who will say that they were white. Why? Because Indo-Europeans had to reinvent themselves, so they took on the identity of others and made all those people white. So in this session, we're going to hone in on the descendants of Ashkenaz, the grandson of Japheth. Who were they really? This 1906 version of the Jewish Encyclopedia is going to tie them to the Scythians. We talked about the Scythians in the last session. I'll leave a link in the description for those who have not watched the video. But this says that the Scythians were a nomadic people occupying territory north of the Black Sea and east of the Carpathian Mountains. Ancient writers refer to the ravages of the Scythian invaders, and many suggest that Ashkenaz of the Bible is equivalent to Scythia. For those of you who may not know, the name Ashkenaz is a trigger word, and I'm not sure why, because the people who say that they are the chosen people in the Middle East disassociate themselves from him. They say that they only took on that name when they migrated to Germany and founded their community. And when did that happen? In the Middle Ages. So we want to know what the historical evidence has to say about them. We're going to have to go back to the beginning and look at where the Japhetic line migrated to. Now, we covered this before, but there may be some tuning in for the first time. So I will say again, we're covering some sensitive information. And yes, folks may be offended, but I can't help that. It's far better for us to know the truth about what went on before than for us to continue to believe the garbage they told us about history. As a result, we have to expose the lies. And there are a lot of lies as it pertains to Ashkenaz. There are a lot of lies. Like Esau, it seems that they have been hiding because they don't want the world to know who they really are. And it's time to find out why. Now, pay attention to where he was originally on this map, because we're going to look at that area again. Now, what we know is that Neanderthals bred with those who left Africa, and this map is showing us where those breeding locations were. Yet again, we see that there was a high infiltration of Neanderthal admixture in the regions given to Japheth. And not surprisingly, the results from the genetic testing is showing this to be true. The areas here in red represent the highest concentration of people carrying the Neanderthal DNA. Where is it? In the portion where Japheth migrated to. Now, for those who say this information is not that important and it doesn't matter, it does. We need to know who we're looking at as we see the prophecies being fulfilled. Also, it doesn't mean that there is no hope for those who may have been affected. Even within Israel, there are some carrying that DNA as a result of slavery and the trafficking of our people around the world. Yes, some of the descendants of Jacob were affected by this. Not all of us, but some. Now, here's what we know. Based on Joel 3:20 through 21, Yah tells us that he will cleanse the blood of his people. Well, why would he need to do that? I believe it's because of the infiltration. And he is the one who created blood in the first place, right? So he's certainly able to purify it. So let's dig into this and find out why 900 years of European history was called the Dark Ages. History Tools is telling us that the period in European history from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE to the Renaissance of the 15th century was once commonly referred to as the Dark Ages. This term was coined by the Italian poet Petrarch in the 1330s to describe what he saw as a period of cultural and intellectual darkness following the bright light of the Greek and Roman civilizations. This article from Church and State is going to give us some additional information. It says how the Catholic Church was largely responsible for the Dark Ages. Historians divide the time since the birth of Christ into three parts: ancient times, the Middle Ages, and modern times. The Middle Ages is a period of dark and turbulent semi-barbarism lying between two phases of civilization: ancient paganism and modern paganism. Now it says between this time, or during this time, Christianity ruled unchallenged. It goes on to say the Middle Ages is a stretch of 1,000 years called medieval and feudal, words that are like the word dinosaur. They are used pejoratively. They mean backward, barbaric, primitive, or at the least old-fashioned, the antithesis of our clever and sophisticated modern times. The reason is that in that 1,000 years, crime, vice, violence, drunkenness, disease, mortality, brutality, exploitation, and injustice were immeasurably worse than before or after. Yet, they are the time when the church was at its most powerful. This is when the church was most powerful. It goes on to say the Middle Ages extend from about 500 AD, when paganism and the Roman Empire went extinct, to about 1500 AD. The half of this period, from about 500 to 1100, are the Dark Ages. The Christian excuse for the Dark Ages is that the degradation of Europe was due to the barbarian invasions, which it took the church several centuries to correct. The barbarians who supposedly caused the Dark Ages through their invasions were not only Christians already, they were not ignorant. Now, that's very telling that it's saying the barbarians were actually Christians. Well, who were those barbarians? Britannica is going to tell us who they were talking about. Barbarian invasions are referring to the movements of Germanic peoples which began before 200 BCE and lasted until the early Middle Ages, destroying the Western Roman Empire in the process. Together with the migrations of the Slavs, these events were the formative elements of the distribution of peoples in modern Europe. Now it's saying modern Europe because the Indo-Europeans came in and basically replaced the indigenous people who were already living in Europe. When they came in and took over, Rome transitioned into the Holy Roman Empire. This says Rome's transition from republic to empire. Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire after power shifted away from a representative democracy to a centralized imperial authority, with the emperor holding the most power. I'm going to share some information from this article from German History Intersections entitled The Holy Roman Empire of the German Nation. On the left, you see their symbol. It's the two-headed eagle. This is the symbol of the Holy Roman Empire. So it says, in the early modern period, Germany did not yet exist as a state in the modern sense with national borders and institutions. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, also known as the Old Empire, was a very loose and fragmented political entity that encompassed both secular and ecclesiastical territories. An emperor presided over this empire, but powers were distributed among various rulers. It goes on to say, it was not until the 14th century that this territory and political entity was identified as German, with the Holy Roman Empire becoming the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. The differentiated political order and territorial fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation called for specific systems of order, symbols, and images that were unlike those from other countries. So this transition happened in the Middle Ages. The Indo-European clans of Japheth that were already mixed with Neanderthal and Esau's DNA came in like a swarm of locusts. And guess who just happened to show up with them? According to Atlas Obscura, and be sure to look at the title, it says the place name Ashkenaz occurs 3 times in the Bible, but by the Middle Ages, the exact origin of Ashkenaz was forgotten. It was forgotten? Well, can we just pause right there? What happened then to the descendants of Ashkenaz? Where did they go? Now listen to what it says next. Because of the migration of the Ashkenazic Jews, it later became associated with Germany. This led to all German Jews being considered Ashkenazic, a term which was then applied to Central and Eastern European Jews who follow Ashkenazic religious customs and who speak Yiddish. It says the Yiddish language, which consists of Hebrew, German, Slavic elements and is written in Aramaic, has been spoken at least since the 9th century AD, but its origins have been debated by linguists for several centuries. Over 200 years it's been debated. While some have suggested a German origin. Others believe a more complex beginning for the language starting in Slavic lands in Khazaria. The Middle Age Khazar Empire that covered present-day southern Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and parts of the Caucasus, and followed by Ukraine, and finally Germany. Although the language adopted a German vocabulary, it retained its Slavic grammar, which is why Yiddish is often referred to as bad German. Now let's go back to the map we looked at earlier, because we know after the flood, we could see where Ashkenaz's portion was. Now look at the other map. Well, what happened to the lineage of Japheth? We see different names here. Now the Ish folks say that they're not connected to this Ashkenaz from Genesis 10. So if it's not them, then let's see if we can find Ashkenaz. Because the waters are so muddy, we're going to have to put pieces of the puzzle together. We're going to read some excerpts from this book that was written in 1910 called The Races of Europe. It's a sociological study written by William Ripley, PhD. Listen carefully, because the dilemma for these anthropologists is that they can't understand why the Ish people in Europe are pale and look like the other Europeans with light skin and eyes. And I'm simply going to read the sources. If you take issue with it, just know that I didn't write it. It says anthropologists have endeavored for a long time to find the cause of these differences in the color of the skin. Some have asserted that they were the direct effects of heat, but our map shows that the American stock, for example, is in no wise affected by it. A consideration of all the races of the earth in general shows no correspondence whatever of the color of the skin with the isothermal lines. The Chinese are the same color at Singapore as at Pekin and at Kamchatka. Failing in this explanation, scientists have endeavored to connect pigmentation of the skin with humidity, or with heat and humidity combined. But in Africa, as we saw, the only really black Negroes are in the dry region near the Sahara Desert, while the Congo Basin, one of the most humid regions on the globe, is distinctly lighter in tint. Others have attempted to prove that this color again might be due to the influence of the tropical sun. It goes on to say, this has at first sight a measure of probability, since the color which appears in tanning or freckles is not to be distinguished physiologically from the pigment which forms in the main body of the skin of the darker races. The objection to this hypothesis is that the covered portions of the body are equally dark with the exposed ones, and that certain groups of men whose lives are peculiarly sedentary, such as the Jews who have spent much of their time for centuries within doors, are distinctly darker than other races whose occupations keep them continually in the open air. This holds true whether in the tropics or in the northern part of Europe. Now, it says study of the color of the skin alone has nothing further to interest us in this inquiry than the very general conclusions we have just outlined. We are compelled to turn to an allied characteristic, namely the pigmentation of the hair and eyes, for more specific results. There are three reasons which compel us to take this action. In the first place, the coloration of the hair and eyes appears to be less directly open to disturbance from environmental influences than is the skin, so that variations in shading may be at the same time more easily and delicately measured. Secondly, the color, or if you please, the absence of color in the hair and eyes is more truly peculiar to the European race than is the lightness of its skin. And just a note here, they're comparing the pale folks in Europe who say that they are descended from the chosen people to Israelites in Africa. Yes, they knew that Israelites were in Africa, and you're going to see proof of that as I go through this. So it goes on to say that there are many peoples in Europe who are darker skinned than certain tribes in Asia or the Americas, but there is none in which blondness of hair and eyes occurs to any considerable degree. It is in the flaxen hair and blue eye that the peculiarly European type comes to its fullest physical expression. This at once reveals the third inducement for us to focus our study upon these apparently subordinate traits. Europe alone, of all the continents, is divided against itself. We find blondness in all degrees of intensity scattered among a host of much darker types. A peculiar advantage is herein made manifest. Nowhere else in the world are two such distinct varieties of man in such intimate contact with one another. From the precise determination of their geographical distribution, we may gain an insight into many interesting racial events in the past. So they could not figure this out. They couldn't understand how those folks who looked just like them claimed to be Israel. And they're actually going to come to a conclusion about the original stock and what the true people look like. So it says, few ancient remains have been found owing to the widespread repugnance to embalming of the dead. The main problem for the somatologist is to have some clue as to whether the family is of Asiatic or African descent. So far as our data for living types are concerned, we get little comfort. Physical traits of the Arabs fully corroborate Britain's and Jastro's hypotheses of African descent. But, on the other hand, many of the living Syrians of Semitic speech are, according to Chantre, as brachycephalic as the Armenians. This, as we shall see in our next chapter, would preclude such an African derivation. So what's the problem? They're confused because they have people in their midst who say that they are the people, and the data is showing that no, that the original stock should really be of African descent. And as I said earlier, there were some who respected their profession enough to tell the truth, even if it hurt. Let's go on. Now, because they couldn't make a determination based on hair, skin, and eyes, they're going to look at the shape of the skull. And what they do is use a cephalic index to compare skull measurements, basically. So they use the skulls of those who had deceased and then compare them to known identities to predict the ancestry and racial categories that they may correspond with. The two main categories used are dolichocephalic and brachycephalic. As you see here on the left, they have determined that the skulls of Negroes are shorter and wider, so they are dolichocephalic, compared to Europeans on the right, who are brachycephalic. Now, Mongols are the measurements in between. So as we go on, they're going to use these classifications to identify the ancestry of what they call the original stock of Hebrews. And this picture will give you an idea of what they're talking about. So let's go back to the article. Now listen to how they try to reason through this. They say a moot point among Jewish scholars is as to the extent of the exodus of their people from Germany into Poland. Bershadsky has done much to show its real proportions in history. So these other two people among anthropologists seem to be inclined to derive this great body of Polish Jews from Palestine by way of the Rhone-Rhine-Frankfurt route. They are, no doubt, partially in the right, but the mere geographer would rather be inclined to side with Jacques. He doubts whether entirely artificial causes, even medieval persecutions, would be quite competent for so large a contract. There is certainly some truth in Harkavy's theory, so ably championed by Eichhoff, that a goodly proportion of these Jews came into Poland by a direct route from the east. Most Jewish scholars had placed their first appearance in southern and eastern Russia, coming around the Black Sea as early as the 8th century. What happened in the 8th century? We had a conversion. So it says Eichhoff, however, finds them in the Caucasus and Armenia 1 or 2 centuries before Christ. Was that Ashkenaz? I don't know. Let's go on and see. It says, then he follows them around, reaching Ruthenia in the 10th and 11th centuries, arriving in Poland from the 12th to the 14th. The only difficulty with this theory is, of course, that it leaves the language of the Polish Jews out of consideration. That is, in both Poland and Galicia, a corrupted form of German, which in itself would seem to indicate a Western origin. On the other hand, the probabilities, judging from our graphic representation, would certainly emphasize the theory of a more general Eastern immigration directly from Palestine north of the Black and Caspian Seas. The only remaining mode of accounting for the large center of gravity in Russia is to trace it to the widespread conversions as the historic one of the Khazars. Whichever one of these theories be correct, and there is probably of an equal division of truth among them all, enough has been said to lead us geographically to suspect the alleged purity of descent of the Ashkenazim Jew. Let us apply the test of physical anthropology. Now let's go on, because now it's going to tell us what the head form range is for Negroes, or those of African descent. It says, on the other hand, the peoples of African or Negroid derivation form a radical contrast, their heads being quite long and narrow, with indices ranging from 75 to 78. What's the range? 75 to 78. It says, this is the type of the living Arab today. Its peculiarity appears in the prominence of the occipital region in our Arab and other African portraits. Scientific research upon these Arabs has invariably yielded harmonious results. From the Semites in the Canary Islands all across northern Africa to Central Arabia itself, the cephalic indices of the nomadic Arabs agree closely. They denote a head form closely allied to that of the long-headed Iberian race, typified in the modern Spaniards, South Italians, and Greeks. It was the head form of the ancient Phoenicians and Egyptians also. We're talking about the children of Ham. Family, Is this not telling us that our makeup is closely aligned with the Egyptians? How then can Egyptians be white? You would think Europeans would get tired and be ashamed of all the lies they've told. All right. So they're saying it should be relatively easy to trace our modern Jews. Based on the results and the data, they're saying it should be easy if indeed, as has so long been assumed, they have remained a pure and undefiled race during the course of their incessant migrations. It says we should be able to trace their origin if they possess any distinctive head form, either to the one continent or the other, with comparative certainty. Now, when you go back to the cephalic index, they're saying that it should be easy to determine who's who because of the shape of the skull. It changes when there has been some admixture. And the Ish were saying that they were of pure blood. So all of their skulls should be the same, right? But Houston, there was a problem. When they used samples from those who lived in the Levant and compared it to them, they got different results. So let's go back to the article to see what they found. Okay, it says, for purposes of comparison, we have reproduced here with a summary of all the results obtained thus far. Inspection of the table shows a surprising uniformity. ICOS limited series of Spagnuoli from Constantinople and that of the Jews from Caucasia and Dagestan are the only ones whose cephalic index lies outside the limits of 80 to 83. In other words, the Jews wherever found in Europe betray a remarkable similarity in head form, the crania being considerably broader than among the peoples of Teutonic descent. As we know, the extremes of head form in Europe measured by the cephalic index extend from 74 to 89. We thus observe that the Jews take a place, listen, rather high in the European series. They are about like the northern French and southern Germans. More important still, they seem to be generally very closely akin in head form to the people among whom they reside. So family. Their head form measured on the high end of the European series. In contrast, the skull of Semitic people measured between 75 to 78, and our people are in that range. So how can we be anti-Semitic? We are the Semites, or should I say we are the Shemites. Let's go on. Now, as we go on here, you're going to see that the evidence is telling them that the Negroes or Africans were the original or the natural branches, and they struggle with this outcome because they are trying to compare apples to oranges, and the two are not the same people. So let's see what it says. It says there can be but one answer, it seems to us. The original Semitic stock must have been in origin strongly dolichocephalic. That is to say, African, as the Arabs are today, from which it follows naturally that about 9/10 of the living Jews are as widely different in head form from the parent stock today as they well could be. The boasted purity of descent of the Jews is then a myth. Renan is right, after all, in his assertion that ethnographic significance of the word Jew for the Russian and Danubian branch at least long ago cease to exist. So it says, or as Lombroso observes, the modern Jews are physically more Aryan than Semitic after all. It says tradition has long divided the Jewish people into two distinct branches, the Sephardim or Southern and the Ashkenazim or North European. Medieval legend among the Jews themselves traced the descent of the first from the tribe of Judah, the second from that of Benjamin. The Sephardim are mainly the remnants of the former Spanish and Portuguese Jews. They constitute in their own eyes an aristocracy of the nation. They are found primarily today in Africa, in the Balkan states, where they are known as Spagnuoli, less purely in France and Italy. A small colony in London and Amsterdam still holds itself aloof from all communion and intercourse with its brethren, so they did not associate with the Ish. It says the Ashkenazim branch is numerically far more important, for the German, Russian, and Polish Jews comprise over 9/10 of the people, as we have already seen. Now, why do they have a large concentration in Germany? Because the natural branches had been trafficked around the world, and they were no longer thought to be Israel. And here's the thing, family. This information has been known for a while now, but every time the evidence comes out to show that folks are not who they say they are, they create a story to try to disprove it and make it seem like they are the exception, much like a chameleon that can change the phenotype and cranial measurements based on migratory practices. They are the only ones in the world who can do that. So let's look at excerpts from this book, and based on the name, you can see who wrote it. He's trying to debunk the outcome of the study that we just read, but you're going to see how they entrap themselves in their own lies. This book was written in 1929, and based on the title, you should know that they're talking about the people identifying themselves as the true people in modern times. That's a clue right there. Let's highlight some of this. It says the predominance of the brachycephalic type among the Jews has led to a revision of the traditional view as regards their Semitic origin, since the peoples of the so-called Semitic stock were dolichocephalic. So they are admitting this. It says even their writers who are in favor of nationalist aspirations, such as Dr. Zolskan and Dr. Jute, have discarded the conventional theory of the origin of their people. So Zolskan has pointed out that it is incorrect to speak of the Semitic race, as this term, like the collateral expression Aryan, simply applies to a family group of languages, but affords no indication of the racial kinship of those among whom they are spoken. According to Zolskan, the Jews at the time of their entry upon the arena of history were the product of an amalgamation of the peoples of North Africa with those of southwestern Asia, and they were particularly influenced by the Assyrian and Babylonian elements among the latter as regards their complexion. So Jute, on the other hand, believes that the Hittites formed the physical nucleus of the Jews, who owe to them their distinctive physiognomical traits, whilst according to Professor von Luskan, the three principal elements in the composition of the Jewish type are the Semites, the Aryan Amorites, and the Hittites. But although it is impossible to establish with exactitude the genesis of the Jewish type, since anthropological science still provides a field of heated conflict, it is sufficient to know that according to unbiased authorities, the racial amalgamation of which the Jews are the product took place some 4,000 years ago, and that they have been preserved intact to the present day. They are saying that the evidence of history strongly supports the view that their race did not suffer any appreciable influx of alien blood in Europe. And they're saying it was because their rabbis discouraged proselytism. And the records of conversion show that their community lost far more in deserters than it gained in proselytes. So they say the only notable exception consisted of the Khazars, a people of Turkish origin who formed an independent kingdom in the south of Russia from the 7th to the 11th century, and whose ruling classes embraced Judaism in 620. But the descendants of these Jewish converts were subsequently absorbed among the Karaites, who do not intermarry with the Orthodox Jews, and thus they cannot form an argument against the purity of the Ish race. So it says, it may therefore be safely concluded that the Jews are comparatively free from any strain of alien blood derived from the nations of Europe, whatever admixture they may have contributed themselves to these nations. So, family, if they are admitting that the original stock was dolichocephalic and they're trying to say they are pretty much a pure race, why are they overwhelmingly brachycephalic? It's not adding up, as you can see here in this cephalic index from studylight.org. It's showing us that out of nearly 3,000 Jewish heads from various countries measured during the last 20 years, they are brachycephalic. Look at the numbers for the Caucasus: 98.3. Ukraine is 86. Russia is 86. But don't believe your lying eyes. Listen to what it says. It says, on an examination of the figures in this table, a remarkable uniformity of the cephalic index of the modern Jews will be noticed, excepting the Caucasian Jews, of whom but few have been measured. It is shown that nearly 90% are between 81.5 and 83. This indicates a limited variability and differentiation. In fact, the differences are so slight from 80 to 83 that they may be fairly assigned to the usual discrepancies between different series of measurements of a single and homogeneous race. Another remarkable fact is the striking absence of the dolichocephalic type, which is characteristic of all the other modern Semitic races and tribes, as the Arabs, Syrians, Abyssinians, etc. I'll drop down. It says the most important problem suggested by a study of craniometrical results concerning the Jews is the relation of the type head of the modern Jews to that of the ancient Hebrews and to the modern Semitic skulls. The pure Semitic skull, they're going to say it again, is dolichocephalic, as may be seen from a study of the heads of modern Arabs, Abyssinians, Syrians. The cephalic index of these races is from 73 to 77, as is at present accepted, listen, by nearly all anthropologists. The shape of the head is the most stable characteristic of a given race. It is little, if at all, influenced by climate, environment, nutrition, or sexual and social selection. Don't miss this part. The only way the type of the head may change is by intermixture with other races. if the ancient Hebrews were of the same stock as the modern non-Jewish Semites, and if the modern Jews are their descendants, then a pure dolichocephalic type of head would be expected among the Jews. It can't get any clearer than that. And when you compare apples to apples, then you won't have all the confusion. Listen to this from New World Encyclopedia, talking about Ashkenazi. It says Ashkenazi Jews, also known as Ashkenazic Jews or Ashkenazim, are Jews descended from the medieval Jewish communities of the Rhineland, so the Middle Ages. Ashkenaz being the medieval Hebrew name for Germany. They are distinguished from Sephardic Jews, the other main group of European Jewry who arrived earlier in Europe and lived primarily in Spain. So where is Ashkenaz? Who is he today? It's funny how we keep seeing the Ukraine, Khazaria, and Scythians pop up in reference to him. I don't think they want to be found. So we're going to wrap up and pick up here next time because I have a lot more to share on Ashkenaz, and I need to spend some time on him because so many equate him with Shem's bloodline, and we need to set the records straight so that we can know who we're looking at in the last days. But if this message has been a blessing to you, please remember to hit the like and share it. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.